is a content warning, pedophilia, and transphobia.
Chapter 1. Trans people are fighting an uphill battle.
And it's not my first time talking about this. I've done other live streams about this, but I wanted to talk more specifically about a particular, link in all of this. And I think that there can be hopefully some realization among those who have not considered the following before. We're trying to dispel misinformation, and there's a lot of it out there when it comes to trans people and trans healthcare. And this isn't just restricted to trans identity and the role that we play in the LGBTQ+ spectrum. But more so, with just information about healthcare, as aforementioned before. What is HRT? What do puberty blockers do? So there's this huge effort to dispel a lot of misinformation. A lot of misinformation has been getting pretty mainstream right now. I don't think I need to explain that part, but I mean, it's still something that's going on today, and it's still happening. Whether or not we fucking put on our fucking Ivy League caps and we just tell people, yo, you are factually wrong, you still get that scenario where you do the ultimate chess piece move and then the pigeon just kicks off all of the pieces. He's not gonna fucking listen. And he's just gonna do what he fucking wants. This is why we're getting books banned in schools and in libraries. This is why we're getting anti-LGBT+ legislation being proposed and passed in a lot of cases. And this can also be said for things such as critical race theory being banned in school, as well as abortion being banned in certain states. I bring these up not necessarily because they're irrelevant, but because they do have their sources coming from the same place. These issues that we are currently facing with today are a factor of the spread of misinformation and the desire for social control. When we talk about misinformation, especially about trans people, we're talking about an entire culture that has for many, many centuries been suppressed by cis heteronormative colonial settler white supremacist imperial fucking bullshit. The gender binary and the racial binary has been reinforced by these structures. And though they are different, they're very, very, very closely related. The binary gender structure is just as reinforced as racism is under settler colonialism and white supremacy. And this is why, Ben Shapiro, intersectionality is important, and it's also why you should actually know what the fuck you're talking about before you talk about it.
Chapter 2. Who is Matt Walsh?
Anyway, with that out of the way, I wanted to focus more on the word groomer. When someone is a fucking creep, I think that they should hold themselves accountable. And I think that's something that we should practice as a culture, as a society. We should hold people accountable when they are being creepy. So then grooming is pretty much what it sounds like. You're grooming a kid to become an adult to do you favors in life. For example, sexual favors later in life. But here's Matt Walsh making this broad fucking claim that trans people and trans accomplices and trans allies were all groomers.
Well, it starts with just recognizing that gender ideology is this pervasive, toxic influence in our culture across the world, across the Western world anyway.
We know that many teachers in this country are groomers, but the question about groomers that isn't asked often enough is who grooms the groomers? In order for teachers to groom children effectively, they must first themselves be groomed. I'm a Nazi for believing that men can't have babies. I'm a Nazi for not wanting preschool teachers to talk to 4-year-olds about their sexuality.
This guy identifies unironically as a theocratic fascist.
I first learned that I was a Nazi many years ago. I don't remember what the opinion was exactly, but I expressed some kind of opinion about something, and I was promptly informed that only Nazis think that way or say those sorts of things. Of course, the confusing part was that my opinion had nothing at all to do with Nazism or anything associated with Nazism. Nonetheless, I was a Nazi, and like so many others, I have relearned this lesson every day since.
This isn't Inglourious Bastards. This is someone who unironically espouses fascist worldview, and I think that should raise some fucking alarm bells for some of y'all. Let's get one thing right out of the way, and that is, before we even engage with this motherfucker's ideas, which I'm not looking forward to doing, this guy has been a bit of a fucking hot button topic for some of us. Because he doesn't shut his fucking mouth, and sometimes maybe you should shut the fuck up. Sometimes, just saying. For example, in a blog post in 2013, he had the audacity to say, "In modern Western society, we've delayed the onset of adulthood, instead inventing a new sort of human. The quote-unquote teenager. The teenager exists in this limbo we created. We call it adolescence. Adolescence is a state-of-the-art modern innovation, like crack cocaine or chemical warfare." No, teenagers are not fucking chemical warfare or crack cocaine. Crack cocaine is something that the United States government traded, but I think if you're calling teenagers somewhat similar or even akin to chemical warfare, which, that's like what Agent Orange is. If you've ever heard of that before, that's chemical warfare right there. You privileged fuck. So anyway, he does elaborate on what he means by adolescence and how teenagers are literally chemical warfare or some stupid bullshit like that. Adolescence isn't a product of brain chemistry. It's a product of our expectations. If we expect 23-year-olds to act like they're 13, then we will get just that. For thousands of years, 13-year-olds were expected to act like they're 23, and those expectations were met. He's advocating for pedophilia, folks. I may be an anarchist, but I am not an ANCAP. But okay, why is Matt Walsh so obsessed with 13-year-olds acting like they're 23? You know what that means, right? That means every time he goes to a family gathering, and he sees his cousin that is 13 years old, he's always like, "Wow, you're so mature for your age."
Man, it's better than Ovaltine. Better than Ovaltine. It's just unbelievable.
Even if we're just going to entertain the idea that Matt Walsh is just saying that 13-year-olds are taking on the task that a 23-year-old would take, like what, right? Are we gonna fucking talk about, the Industrial Revolution? Where children were forced into labor since birth, and it required workers going on strike in order to pass child labor laws? If you really are endorsing child labor, just look no further than the NAFTA treaty. All of these fucking global policies that allows the United States to have fucking factories in Bangladesh. Look at all of the go travel the world. You will find US endorsed child labor factories. They exist. They're called sweatshops. If that's your dream, then your dream came true, bro. But of course not. No. He's talking about fucking underage people.
Chapter 3: How Rape Culture Sustains Pedophilia and Transphobia. I would like to take a bit of a detour from talking about Matt Walsh, but to focus more on his words and his intent, and we will be using media to explain my point. Let us start in 1955, where the Russian-American author by the name of Vladimir Nabokov published an erotic fiction novel aptly titled Lolita. It's about a man by the name of Humbert who marries a woman and becomes sexually obsessed with a 12-year-old girl named Dolores, whom he nicknames Lolita. In this story, Lolita is seen licking lollipops, playing with her skirt, and flirtatiously seducing Humbert. In the story, Humbert is portrayed as helpless, as if his desires are out of his control, and he caves into his forbidden lust, or whatever. And I think that's where my summary should end here, because This isn't a movie review or book review for that matter. I think what's more important is that we discuss the roles that these two characters, Dolores and Humbert, play in this story. Dolores is written in such a way that she is written to be the antagonist, putting poor innocent Humbert, who is written to be the protagonist, in such a predicament. After all, the narration of this novel is strictly told in the perspective of Humbert, not Dolores. But who is really establishing Humbert as the protagonist, or the good guy, really? Who is saying that Humbert is telling the truth even when retelling the story to the reader? Why should we believe Humbert when he tells us that Dolores, a 12-year-old girl, is flirtatious and seductive? In other words, when Humbert is telling the story, what is on Humbert's resume as he tells the story in his myopic perspective that we are supposed to believe that he is even remotely reliable? I would argue that there is a strong possibility that the story as it is told in Lolita are simply lies, and as such is an attempt to get Humbert to justify his actions in molesting a 12-year-old girl. So I want to use another example, and before I continue, talking about Lolita just now made me kind of sick, and this next example isn't going to get any better. It's going to get a lot worse than the previous example, but even with everything mentioned, I would still make the same argument as I did before with Lolita, and everything still is very much the same here. When I was 12 years old, I went to the Buena Vista Library in Burbank, California with my grandfather, where there was said to be a seminar featuring some animators in the anime industry, one of which was actually someone who worked on Samurai Jack.
Cool.
I don't remember who that person was to this day, but I was very into Samurai Jack at the time, so I was really enthusiastic on going to this event. It was such a good time for me to also dip my toes into anime for the first time, since I was kind of sheltered up until this point in my life. At this event, a lot of new anime releases were shown to us, whether they were trailers or debuted episodes. One of which of these new releases was an English dub of a quote-unquote romantic comedy titled I, My, Me, Strawberry Eggs. I just vomited in my mouth a little after reading that title. This anime starts off with a landlord collecting rent from bedridden tenants, pointing and firing a handgun in a batshit crazy and deranged manner, although that's pretty accurate for how landlords behave in real life, so points for that at least. It then cuts to school kids talking until there's a panning shot of a schoolgirl bent over with her panties exposed. As a 12-year-old myself, this scene made me really uncomfortable, as it did with my grandfather, and he even offered to take off with me without hesitation. I agreed. As much as I hate my grandfather so fucking much, this was one of the few times where we were on the same page about something. So years later, I wondered what the hell this anime was all about. Well, it turns out that this is not only just a really fucking pervy anime, but I also learned why it's called a quote-unquote romantic comedy. The so-called romance part is the teacher, Hibiki Almawa, is preying on the student, Fuko Kozuha. Sorry for my shitty Japanese pronunciations. So that's your pedophilia quota for this anime, but their so-called comedy lays within the transphobic trope that Hibiki is cross-dressing as a woman to be employed at an all-girls school in order to prey on Fuko. So very similarly to the novel Lolita, this story is largely told in the perspective of Hibiki, who is also our unreliable narrator. So this story was written by Yuji Yamaguchi, who mainly specialized in adult light novels, and even a few anime episodes such as Outlast Star, and even some visual novel games. With that being said, we can conclude that the story written in I My Me Strawberry Eggs is unsurprisingly meant for the male gaze. All of it, from the lewd scenes of underage girls to the teacher being a cross-dressing predator. Notice that I am using the word cross-dresser and not transgender. Someone who is cross-dressing is someone who wears a costume temporarily. Usually this is done by cisgender men strictly as a fetish, where transgender women don't wear feminine clothes and cosmetics for a fetish. It is actually rather our identity. It is how we express ourselves and who we are.
I do think that it is important to note that sometimes trans people do cross-dress, largely because that's their circumstance and that's the only option that they have if they are trying to come out of the closet. Some trans people stay in the closet for a very long time, and they're not entirely sure when that time is for trans people to come out of the closet, so they resort to cross-dressing in private. And these kinds of circumstances can vary, whether it be homophobic and transphobic parents, or you're in a heterosexual marriage and you're legally obligated to please your spouse. Or thus, play a role, because if you break that role, it could jeopardize things in your marriage. That's why sometimes trans people do cross-dress, and so I want to make that distinction. There is a huge difference between cross-dressing, generally speaking, and transgender people, even though sometimes they can overlap. I mean, I'm a trans woman, I'm not a cross-dresser, but here's pictures of me cross-dressing. I look fucking awful.
And I think that this is where we may have people stuck with the conclusion that trans people are inherently sexual in nature, which must be really hard for asexual transgender and asexual non-binary folks, because that's kind of a really shitty stereotype to be paired with if you live that way. This social belief is held in place because of the media's common misrepresentation of us, and it leads people to harmful conclusions about us, with this misconception being reinforced by popular media. People will make this conclusion that trans people are just a fetish and not to be seen as a people group, which is where we begin to see tenets of fear-mongering within these extremist groups while using children as a moral panic device, and that's where all that stems up as well. And before Matt Walsh responds to the video and tries to pull some, why is she talking about these weird, creepy pedophiles' tales and shit? My friend, you're not supposed to sympathize with the protagonist. You're not supposed to sympathize with the pedophile. Anyway, I want to make it clear that as I summarize Lolita and I My Me Strawberry Eggs, I am not endorsing these stories or perspective. In fact, I wouldn't even call either one of these stories profound in any way. However, I do think that there is value in critically analyzing the intentions of these stories, who is telling these stories, and for what purpose. So then, what does Matt Walsh, of all people, have anything to do with this at all? Well, Matt Walsh had some very specific views on women, particularly teenage girls, and the role that they play as they grow up into becoming adults. I think that we should heed a thick layer of caution for anyone who presents a documentary called What Is a Woman, while they have a blog talking about how teenage girls are akin to crack cocaine and chemical warfare. Because of this really strange narration provided by Matt Walsh about teenage girls, there is an implied danger with Matt Walsh being around teenage girls. After all, if something were to be told to me as chemical warfare, I would want to steer clear of it. I would be afraid to be near that thing. So if Matt Walsh is calling teenage girls chemical warfare, well, there's got to be a reason for there being chemical warfare, right? There's got to be a reason for something to use teenage girls as a form of chemical warfare on whatever they are targeting. You see how fucking crazy this sounds?
I'm gonna tell all of you a secret, okay? It's not the teenage girls that you need to worry about. It's Matt Walsh. He's the one you need to fucking worry about. He's a fucking creep.
The author is making this context as if there is something mischievous going on, and that author is Matt Walsh. So I just don't understand why it is so important to Matt Walsh that cisgender girls are fertile when they are teenagers. I don't understand why Matt Walsh is acting like there is some forbidden thing that he can't necessarily talk about, unless of course he wants to talk about the age of consent, which of course that's where we lead into making the age of consent lower so that people can fuck underage girls quicker and easier. After all, given that this is a Facebook blog being archived and it is on the internet, and we all know how internet debates about the age of consent goes, it is never about the age of consent going up, but they are more fixated on the idea of the age of consent going down. These weird ANCAP types, these fucking libertarians, worms and shit, these fucking fascists, what they are really, all these people are just so fucking obsessed with lowering the age of consent. You don't believe me? Well, look, I can only think of one conclusion here, and that Matt Walsh is super fucking horny for teenage girls, because he concludes his 2013 blog with this. At about 16, you're an adult who is mature and can make decisions. You are that at 16. I don't care what anybody says. And if you're gonna tell me it's different, well, then how come for the first 10,000 years of human civilization, that's the way it was? It's just recently where all of a sudden we're all blank until we're 25?
In the last 10 years, there's been a lot of awareness of who trans people are, what trans people are, and the history of trans people and trans liberation. And as I mentioned earlier, trans people are subjected to colonialism and the same colonial structures that make racism as a binary structure to oppress others. So I want to dispel that misconception that trans people are a new thing, it's all on Tumblr or whatever. Because trans people have always been here since the dawn of human history. I mean, look throughout all of the world. Look throughout India and Hijra culture and how the British monarchy and the British Empire fucking oppressed that as well. Look throughout the United States history and indigenous genocide. Look through all of these fucking imperialistic forces. Tell me that this isn't actively happening on a daily fucking basis since the dawn of colonialism. And so when you frame the whole trans population as a recent phenomenon, it's very easy to convince people and to manipulate people, especially parents, with misinformation that children are being groomed by trans people. This supposed fucking narrative that trans people are grooming kids. We're now at this point where we're reading Matt Walsh's blog from like 2013, where he fucking says that for 10,000s of years of human civilization, that it was okay for you to just fuck teenagers. Like, just because the word teenager is a more modernly defined term. Because the answer to that question is we've grown from that, right? We've grown from understanding that teenagers are off limits, my friend. This is what happens when you don't teach things like sex and gender are complete opposite from each other. This is what happens when you don't have like normalized sexual education in school or gender studies in school. This is what happens when you defund Planned Parenthood. You got creepy men with a lot of political influence who have these kinds of fucking beliefs, and they can manipulate the audience to think that fucking pedophilia is more socially acceptable than LGBT people.
And since this blog resurfaced, Matt Walsh had some choice words to say about the backlash he's received.
So here's my official answer, for the record. Kiss my ass. I do not apologize. In fact, by all rights, you sick freaks should be the ones apologizing to me.
Oh, look, an idiot. Let's point and laugh.
And doing it all because I'm trying to prevent you from sexually mutilating children.
At 16, you're an adult, who is mature, and can make decisions. You are that at 16. I don't care what anyone says. And if you're gonna tell me it's different, well, then how come for the first 10,000 years of human civilization, that's the way it was? It's just recently, where all of a sudden, we're all blank. Until we're 25.
You damned monsters. You child-abusing psychopaths.
At 16, you're an adult, who is mature, and can make decisions. You are that at 16. I don't care what anyone says. And if you're gonna tell me it's different, well, then how come for the 10,000 years of human civilization, that's the way it was? It's just recently, where all of a sudden, we're all blank. Until we're 25.
I wouldn't apologize to you, soulless parasites, if I had a gun to my head. Instead, I'd rather just tell you all to piss off. I apologize for nothing. I concede nothing. I will never surrender even a single inch of ground to a pitchfork mob of degenerate morons. You know, the secret they never say out loud is that nobody is truly canceled unless they consent to it. And they willingly play their assigned roles. Well, I do not consent. And I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going anywhere.
As a trans woman, to Matt Walsh, I just want to say this. You say you're not gonna go anywhere? Well, of course you're not gonna go anywhere. You're a fucking loser. You're a deadbeat fucking pedophile and a transphobe. I don't care if you're gonna go anywhere or not. I don't care if you tell me to piss off. The only place you're gonna go to is to your room, and you're gonna think about how foolish you are, how much of a fucking joke your whole life has been. You're not gonna go anywhere because you have like Nazis and pedophiles and ANCAPs and libertarians as your fucking fan base. That's really all you have. You try to appeal to TERFs to use plausible deniability that you are a fucking predator. I would not trust you around kids. I would specifically warn people to stay the fuck away from you. You are dangerous, like, to children. And some people are gonna say, oh, well, he hasn't done anything yet. I mean, first of all, you don't know that. And secondly, with this individual's worldviews, especially on women, children, trans people, and just other people in general, I would say that's enough for me to raise the alarm bells. And why does there need to be a child harmed by this individual for us to finally raise the alarm bells? Why does that need to be the standard before we say maybe this person shouldn't have a platform? Maybe someone should check his fucking search history. I'm a little concerned that there may be some cheese pizza somewhere within his browsing history.